Hello and welcome to another IndySoft Tip Tuesday. Today we're going to go over how to create new users, adjust their user profiles, their roles within the system, as well as the difference between users and employees. We've had a lot of new customers recently that have had this question, as well as companies with a fair amount of turnover. So people have found themselves in new roles with new responsibilities, and that needs to be updated and reflected inside of IndySoft. So to get started, managing users and their roles must be done by a system administrator. So whoever is your system admin has the ability to log in, and when they do, they can go to this gear wheel in the upper right for settings, and with a admin, they'll have a series of options available to them. Profile Manager is where we're going to handle all the users. So once you launch Profile Manager, it's going to come up, and there are three distinct sections in here. There are other videos through our YouTube channel, and I highly recommend that you check them out, that go into Profile Manager in more depth. And so we won't go too deep into each one of these sections, but a quick glance. On the left-hand side, this full column here, that's going to be where all your users are listed. In the top right, that is going to be a breakdown by user profile of individual abilities for that profile and how you can manage what that user profile has access to do or what you want to block them from doing. In the bottom right-hand section, you have a series of filters. You can choose from profiles, companies, or you can apply company filters, and we'll go through these briefly here in a minute. So when you go to add a new user, you can do so either by the options menu, new user, or the plus symbol here. Now, if you have read-only, and there's another video about setting up read-only users, if you have read-only licenses, when you click this drop-down, you'll see add user full client or add user read-only. This setup, we only have the full client license, so we'll go ahead and add a user here. So you can enter in your username. Has to be all together, no spaces. And you can set your password. So when setting up a new user, you may want to use a generic password, and we'll set up something very simple. But you have this option here to request new password at next login. So you can set them up with a generic, but the first time that that user logs in, they will be prompted to set their own password. There are a number of password options that you can also set in here, how often you want to request a new password, and under the Management tab, there are other password-related rules and conditions that you can apply as well. You also want to select their profile. So just starting out, you can select whichever one of these profiles is going to apply to this new user. We're going to start this one off with no access. And then you're going to select which company this employee is going to be associated with this user. Employees and users are a distinct concept, and I'm going to go into this a little bit more in a minute, but users manage access. Employees are records within the database. So we're going to start assigning an employee to this particular user. So you can select from a list that's the employee list associated with this company. So you can select a different company if you have a different set of employees. Say you have multiple branches, multiple sites, and you want to keep your employee list separate. So you can do that by having them under different companies. We're going to choose ABC Company, and we're going to say that the user that we're going to add is not already in this list. So we're going to just call this new user, new user. And when we move past the employee ID field, it's going to prompt us if that user is an employee in that record or in that company, and you can add them if they are not. So we'll click yes to add that employee record to this company. And you can also add an email. So there are a couple other options down here. Active, that means that user is going to be able to log in and assume whatever rights their profile has granted them. You also can set a default user. And with user location preferences and settings, you can establish a lot of defaults and other options that are covered in several other YouTube videos. But by using a default user, you can pull those from that user and apply that to each new user if you choose. By checking this box, you would indicate that this user is going to become the default. Right now, the current default is IndySoft. That is the only user that is currently in the system. So we're going to go ahead and add this user. So now we've got user 1, and that user has no access. We're going to drag this over so you see a little bit more. And we've updated here, so got our employee name, new user, company, ABC company, and test as the email. So to see that this has been added to our employee record, minimize this. We're going to come back over and go to our add edit, into employees, and once I refresh this, so now we see we've got our new user in our user list, and when we pull this up, it's pulled in the email address that we assigned in the user or in the profile manager. All right, so we'll jump back over to Profile Manager, and I'll expand this up. Okay, so we've got our user here, but right now that user has no access. So if they log in, they would be allowed to log in, but they can't see any equipment, they can't interact with any companies, so they're sort of, the user is sort of dead on arrival. They can't do anything with a no access profile. To change that, you just click and drag, drop on the user to change their profile. So you would select from the profiles in the bottom right and just click and drag. And if you need to change one that's already assigned, again, you just click and drag and replace what was there previously. So maybe you have a situation where you have multiple companies, where you have a user that is in that you only want to have access to see assets that are in a particular company. Well, you can do that by applying companies to the user. So we would leave the main login with no access, and then we would drag up the company that we want to apply. Now you see it's got the drop down with that company listed under. Again, it's just pulling down that same level of no access. We're going to change that to a standard user. So in this case, when the user 1 logs in, they would be able to have standard user level rights to the ABC company, but they would not be able to see any assets that were stored in any of the other companies. You can continue this pattern if you wanted to add another company to them and say that one they're actually a system admin for. So you can have different levels of rights for those users per company. And then when that user logs in, they would see that they have access to these two companies, and whenever they change which equipment they're looking at. So when they switch their company, in the equipment view, once they switched what is displayed here to that other company, then those level rights would be afforded to them. All right, so one of the other concepts that I wanted to touch on is the difference between a user, and an employee. Users are set up in the system to manage and regulate access. That defines what they can interact with and what level of interaction they can have on assets in individual companies. Employees are a record in the database that can be assigned when perhaps that person doesn't have IndySoft access. And to demonstrate that, the scenario that may be in play is that you have multiple technicians, but those technicians aren't each going to log into IndySoft. Maybe you haven't purchased a license, enough licenses to have everybody log in. So in that case, perhaps they are still doing work outside of the system, but you want to record it in the system. When you're looking at your events, and depending on how you've configured your events, you would have the ability, say they came into repair and are performed by. That's going to pull from your employee list. So perhaps James Gordon did the work on this, but James never logs into IndySoft and doesn't have a reason to. So you can say that James was the one that did the work, while they themselves never logged into the system. A user must always be tied to an employee. An employee can exist without a user association. So again, you can have these employee lists to designate what work was done by someone by adjusting that within the event when that person never needs to log into the system and therefore does not need to have a user profile. I hope this helps with the user setup for all of you new users and users that have just changed roles. If you do have any questions, you can always reach out to us, support@indysoft.com, and happy calibrating.